Welcome to another episode of Ask the Expert. I am Amy Board. I am your host. And today's topic is that topic that we're all thinking about. We are all discussing here in the hemophilia community. Today we are going to discuss the update on the gene therapy clinical trial process, future treatments within hemophilia, non-factor replacement therapy, all of those things that have huge question marks. Today we're going to have a conversation with one of the leading researchers in the country, specifically about future hemophilia treatments. I'd like to make a note right off the bat to our VWD listeners, our listeners with von Willebrand's disease. You get your own update podcast next month. Next month, we are actually going to be discussing von Willebrand's disease, future treatments, any research updates. We're really going to spend our entire time on VWD. So my VWD listeners, have no fear. We will get to you next month. My hemophilia listeners, this episode truly is for you. I hope you can, again, listen to all this stuff that is swirling around, just to add to your arsenal of how to ask better questions when you are in that room with your physician. If there is one thing that I'm slowly starting to understand about this paradigm shift in treatment within hemophilia is we are truly going to have a playing field of actual choice. There's going to be choices within treatment. I don't think treatment is going one way or the other. I think it is going to be individualized and really going to be up to you and your family and your lifestyle of what you are going to decide going forward. So being an informed consumer is becoming more and more important. And this isn't just for the hemophilia space, as you know. Treatments like gene therapy are spreading over a lot of rare disease, a lot of chronic disease, and I'd like to think that the hemophilia community can be a leader in terms of how we show up, how we ask questions, and how we inform ourselves going into those conversations with our physicians. So I hope this is just another tool, today's conversation, that will add to your arsenal. We're going to be answering some listeners' questions, which is fantastic. We had a small submission call out to see if we could get any questions from you, our listeners, about what you're interested in terms of future treatments. And of course, you guys came through. So we're going to talk about side effects. We're going to talk about that question of how long will it last? Will it last 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? How long is it supposed to last? Can you get a gene therapy treatment again with a different vector or the same vector if it doesn't work the first time? So we're going to answer some of those questions. I'm very excited about our conversation today. Before that, let's do our thing. Let's do a shout out to our Bloodstream podcast. If you haven't had a listen to the latest episode, please do. Patrick was so excited to be able to go to the Rare Disease Film Festival here in California this past month. Bombardier Blood was one of the films screened at the festival, and he so enjoyed it. And he really documented his experience in the latest Bloodstream podcast, so make sure to check that out. It was really great. It was a good hemophilia showing to the rest of the rare disease world. So please check that out. Again, with podcasts like this, having your questions and your thoughts to help me build interviews and to kind of decide what topics you guys would like to hear going forward, it's really important to me. So I just want to do another plug. Please, if you have questions or thoughts about future podcasts, about certain guests, if you would like to hear from someone, or you'd like to hear from a physical therapist or another doctor or an OBGYN, please let me know. You can find me on Twitter. You can always tweet at me at Bordo87, or you can email, which is classy. Emailing is classy, let's be honest. So you can email me at mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. I would absolutely love to hear from you. So let's get to it. My guest today is one of my favorite people within this community. I can tell you that I personally reached out to him for this topic. I think he is not as well known as some of our other hematologists in the country in terms of visibility. He is on the quieter side, but he is warm and wonderful, and he is a principal investigator for many clinical trials from the University of Colorado, the Hemophilia and Thrombosis Center there in Denver, Colorado. Dr. Michael Wang is the clinical director there, and of course, one of the pediatric hematologists there in Colorado. He has been mentored by Dr. Marilyn Mako Johnson there in Colorado, and he's wonderful. He has been so generous with me personally as a chapter executive director with his time, and he has answered any question I might have. And as I have grown in this work, trying to advocate for the bleeding disorders community, Dr. Mike has been instrumental in educating me and guiding me towards the science aspect of this work. And so I am so grateful that you guys get the opportunity to get a listen with Dr. Mike. He's wonderful. He is very personable. He will not drone on. I am pleased to say that this episode, I think, is only like 40 minutes, which I'm sure you guys are going to be like, come on, we could have used like an hour and a half. But he's so succinct and he's wonderful. And I'm really excited that you guys get an opportunity to hear from Dr. Mike. So please grab yourself a cup of coffee and let's have ourselves a conversation. I am your host, Amy Board, and welcome to episode 33, or our The Paradigm Shift in Hemophilia Treatment episode of the Ask the Expert podcast. Welcome to Ask the Expert, Dr. Mike. I am so thrilled to have you on the podcast. Would you begin by telling our listeners a little bit about your role at the HTC in Colorado?
Sure. At the HTC here in Denver, I'm the clinical director, which really assets clinical care for the center. Our center has been involved in a lot of clinical research over the years. And so my other role is that I am the principal investigator for all of the sponsored trials, whether that be new products or outcomes trials.
So today on the podcast, I wanted to have you on because, personally, for me, you have been a trusted advisor for me personally over the years, but also you have, I have seen you explain future therapies, gene therapy, research that's being developed to our patient families in Colorado. And I've always been so impressed about how personal and human you have been with these families. So I'm so excited to have you on to talk about some of this stuff, just kind of in a candid conversation. To begin, I'd love to know what stage the gene therapy clinical trial process is at. We've heard about it for so long. We're anticipating that there might be an approval, maybe even next year. So where is the trial process currently?
That's a great place to start. As you mentioned, gene therapy really has been in our minds for at least 2 decades. And the early trials ran into a number of challenges. But starting about a decade ago, some of the gene therapy trials, specifically with hemophilia B patients, started to show some real successes and some advances in therapy, which people could build upon. Right now, I think that the likelihood that we're going to have an approved gene therapy product possibly in 2020 is real. And this will likely be because of enrollment for hemophilia A patients. But the enrollment and excitement about at least 2 hemophilia B phase 3 studies is very high. And so I think that probably within the next 2 years, we could see gene therapy available to both hemophilia A and hemophilia B patients.
Explain your role in the clinical trial process. I know Colorado is a clinical trial site for several things, including gene therapy, but what does that mean and what is your role personally as a hematologist?
Sure. So for an HTC to do a clinical trial, you need to have a number of things in place. And the most important thing is really a well-informed group of patients, patients who have had a long-standing relationship with the center, to where both the patients and the providers feel like they're having really clear communication about potentially, risky advances in terms of clinical research. If you have that, then the next thing that is really needed is a very strong clinical research team, which includes a pharmacist, sometimes some laboratory personnel, but mainly some clinical researchers who really are very ethically based and who are always thinking about the best outcomes in terms of risks and benefits for patients. And then you would need a principal investigator, and that's my role. And that's mainly to have oversight of patient selection, and then to also, with the clinical researchers and the sponsor, to go through all of the patient data, the voluminous patient data that's collected during the trial, to ensure that the trial is run safely. And so, to me, the biggest aspect of all of these clinical trials are patient safety. And so we spend a tremendous amount of time having the infrastructure to ensure that.
So what have you learned from the trials up to this point?
Wow, that's a very good question. So we are participating in both Hemophilia A and Hemophilia B trials. I would say on the patient side, like many other advances, there are a variety of reasons why patients do not want to participate in gene therapy. We certainly have had many early adopters where they have seen more of the upside than the risk, and then we have many patients who seem much more skeptical. And what has been most surprising to me, and I think it's been very reassuring actually, is that patients are thinking through this therapy, just like most of the other therapies, including the non-factor therapies, very carefully. I don't see people making huge leaps of faith for them to understand or participate, and they are asking great questions. Gene therapy is complicated. When it's explained to many people, it sounds like you just get a medicine that's a virus, and that the virus carries a gene on it, and that gene goes to the liver, and then after the virus infects a liver cell, the liver cell then has the capacity to produce either factor 8 or factor 9. But it's really much more complicated, and it has to do with one is that all of us are very, very biologically different. And so how you're going to respond mostly immunologically to that vector has been surprising to me. I haven't been able to look at a person and say, you're going to be a person that's going to have a good or bad response, for instance. The other thing that's surprising, and I think it's borne out in the data that's publicly available, is that we really can't predict what your level of factor 8 or factor 9 expression is going to be. And the variability around that is very great, from expressing in the hundreds of percents or over 100% to no expression at all. And when you look at the patient, you really can't say prior to the therapy who is going to express that. And then I guess the other surprise to me is that these are really difficult clinical trials in terms of the amount of time that's required on the staff, but also on the patient. Some trials request that the patient come as often as twice a week to get examined and to get labs drawn. All of them have a period of time when you have to come in weekly. And I've been really amazed, actually, at how consistent our patients have been in coming to all of these appointments in, frankly, horrible weather. And I think it goes to show that these patients have taken into consideration all of the variables and the commitment that it takes. And they really do want to be a part of the learning process. And they really want this to be successful, not only for themselves, but for other patients in the future.
We're going to go into a little bit of what you discussed, but first, just as an overview, describe how you have been explaining how gene therapy works to your patients.
We have been explaining gene therapy really, so for at the moment for hemophilia, the type of gene therapy that is available is gene addition therapy. And what that means is that you're giving the patients a virus, and that virus is infecting a certain cell type, and it's adding a gene to that cell that then is able to be expressed and to make a specific protein such as factor 8 or factor 9. And one of the confusions coming in is whether this is actually gene editing, where you would actually replace a gene, and it's not that. And so what we tell patients is that their gene therapy is where they are going to get a virus that is able to infect their cells of their liver, and that virus carries a gene, and that gene is going to be expressed, and that gene won't become integrated into that liver cell. It'll always just exist by itself in the cytoplasm, and that gene then takes over the machinery of the cell to then make the factor 8 or factor 9. As part of the process, we also explain the patient's response to this, which is that because it is an outside virus, the patient is going to have an immune response against this virus. And that immune response is really trying to get rid of it. And so the way that gene therapy works now is that you're able to get many cells stably infected and not eradicated by the immune system. And that one of the early markers that we look for is this immune attack against the liver. And that's one of the few things that we try to make an intervention on early during the gene therapy process. There have been many other explanations out there. I think the National Hemophilia Foundation has a video that it actually has a very good explanation of this process, but for the most part, that's how we talk about gene therapy.
In talking about the virus, we had a listener that asked the question, would you be able to get gene therapy again with the same virus or the same vector if you didn't get the expression that you wanted to? That is a question that has been circulating.
I think that's an excellent question. Right now, the gene therapy trials are trying to answer that, but not as directly as that question is asked. So right now, if you are enrolling into a gene therapy trial, you first have to go through a screening process. And this screening process looks to see if you have previous immunity to that specific virus that your gene therapy is working through. So, for instance, these are all AAVs, which stands for adeno-associated virus, and it's a non-human virus that's able to infect humans, and it has many different types, and that's called a serotype. And so you could have a type 5, for instance, or a type 2, or a type 8, and so the sponsors are checking to see, for instance, if they have a type 5 virus, if you already have pre-existing type 5 immunity. And if you do, many companies are saying that you can't get that gene therapy because they would predict that it would be ineffective because you already have an immune response that will just wipe it out immediately. Having said that, there is one program that at the current time says that pre-existing immunity shouldn't be a barrier because they have had patients who have been immune and they've given their gene therapy vector 2 and they've expressed their factor. And it's not that they only expressed a little bit, they expressed a really decent amount. And so it may be that people with pre-existing immunity would be able to get another dose of a a gene therapy vector of the same type that they're already immune to. I know other companies are going to look into dosing previously immune patients, but I haven't yet seen a trial design yet that actually answers that specific question, which is, if you get a vector from one company, can you get that vector again as a second try? And I haven't seen that proposed yet.
So who can become a qualified candidate for gene therapy? What is something you look for, especially in the clinical trial process? What is a good candidate?
So good candidates are people who have already been in the habit of keeping pretty meticulous logs and records of their factor use and bleeding, because it's one of the requirements that companies have is a historical log, and they want you to log very accurately going forward. People can't have had significant liver disease or any abnormality in their liver function testing. And those patients currently are excluded because it's felt to be that they are unsafe. Another qualification, which has less to do about the patient's health, is that they have to be available to come see us every week. And depending on the trial, it's every week for upwards of 30 weeks in a row. And so there is a significant time commitment to coming to a center or getting your labs drawn that is very difficult for some patients, and many have told us up front that they would be unable to do that. And then finally, I think that patients who are considering undergoing gene therapy are going to be faced with a lot of unknowns and a lot of ambiguity. It's an unknown therapy. We can't tell them how high their level is going to go. Currently, we can't tell them how long this is going to last. To your previous question, we can't tell them if they can get treated again. And so it's a person that you can discuss all of those questions and in their heart of hearts really feel like this is really an option for them. What I've seen in many patients is that they really upfront realize that this is a clinical trial and it's not clinical care. And they see that some of the arduousness of this type of stringent visit requirement is really for the good of future patients. And so I think a person that has the mindset that is outward looking, that is looking about what they can do to help others, is also very, very beneficial.
Another question we had from our listeners is side effects. Wondered if you could provide a little bit more clarification on the side effects that you're starting to see with gene therapy.
Sure. So the most immediate side effect that we see is that many people feel like they have a cold. And so when they get infused at their infusion center, they get a lot of virus. Billions or trillions of viral particles are infused all at once. And so within the first week, many people feel like they have a cold, like the flu. But it's not universal. There have been people who not really felt all that bad at all. And so immediately that's the first thing that we see. The side effect that we most carefully follow are the effects on the liver. So this virus is very specific for infecting the liver in humans. And you can have two things occurring. You can have the direct effect of having a very large infection of your liver, so a hepatitis. And then you can have the effect of the immune response trying to kill the cells that are infected, which is your liver. And so the biggest side effect that we follow most closely is really the amount of stress that your liver is on. to treat that, we immune suppress patients, and so they would need to go onto an oral steroid for a prolonged period of time. And that's not only to protect the liver, but to protect the cells that are producing the factor 8 or factor 9. And that, to me, is probably the side effect that we've followed the closest and that we're most concerned about so far. We haven't had cases here or that I've heard of patients getting clotting complications, for instance, like a blood clot. I haven't heard of other organs being involved or hurt, such as the kidney or the heart or anything else. But it's really mainly the liver that we're watching.
Of course, people are wanting to know how long the gene therapy treatment will last. I think there have been rumors around that this would be a quote-unquote cure, and now they're starting to circulate that this, therapy will only last for, a certain amount of years. So some people have mentioned having hesitancy towards those unexpected reactions to the liver and efficacy. So I just wanted to ask, what's the latest? What have you been seeing?
Right. So I think for duration of therapy, there is a little bit that can be said. So there is a group of patients that was reported about 10 years ago by an investigator at the University of College London, Dr. Nathwani, and they have presented this cohort of men, and it's less than 10 men, who had hemophilia B and got really a very early stage of gene therapy. And what he showed a couple of years ago at the American Society of Hematology Conference was that all of them were still expressing factor 9, albeit at very low levels. But again, back in the day of over a decade ago, what we were really trying to do was to get patients to be able to go from severe to moderate. And so we were hoping that they would get 3%, 4%, 5%, as opposed to the really tremendous results that we're seeing today where patients are getting 10%, 20%, 30%, or even over 100% expression. But what we can say in those patients is that they've had a duration now of over 8 years of stable expression, and that their expression has been mostly unchanged since about 6 months post gene therapy infusion. And so the durability looks to be, in that type of setting, to be at least a decade. Again, what is happening today is that you're using a therapy that's based on that therapy, so it's a similar type of virus, but not the same. And there have been other modifications along the way to make it better, to express more, etc. And so I don't really think we can say what the trajectory is until we start to follow patients out that long. I think the hope is that patients will express for at least 10 years.
So what are you personally most encouraged about in terms of the future treatments for hemophilia?
Wow, that's a big question. I think it's really huge, because I think there are lots of things that patients with hemophilia should be really, really excited about. And I will say that I think that they can be excited for a number of reasons. So one is that there's going to be a large variety of choices. And so the choice of therapy is going to be able to be somewhat individualized to your own life, what your activities are, what your general health is, how you view the risks of certain types of therapy, and what type of protection you want. So, for instance, there are going to be clinical trials in factor 8 molecules that look like they have half-lives that are as long as the current factor 9 molecules. So you can get really prolonged expression to where weekly infusion is a reality that will give you very high troughs, upwards of 10% at the end of the week. And so for patients and providers who really prefer to use factor VIII, there's going to be a really good factor VIII option out there. And if you were able to infuse, for instance, more than once a week, you could start to probably push your trough into the 20 to 30 to 40 range reliably, which is much more than we can say for gene therapy, right? We don't know. Again, I cannot predict a patient is going to express 1% versus 90%. But with this drug, I can reliably make a regimen for you that can keep you really, really high, to be clearly almost even in the normal range. I think non-factor therapy, as we've seen with Emmysysm AB, is only going to get more interesting. The first is that we're going to, as each day passes, we are gaining experience with Emmysysm AB, its benefits and its risks. And so we will be able to, in a year, give patients better information about its use and expected outcomes. And while saying that, I think there are going to likely be other bispecific antibodies developed. Certainly, there's phase 3 trials now in what we are calling the rebalancing therapies, such as small interfering RNA against antithrombin and monoclonal antibodies against tissue factor pathway inhibitor, TFPI. And those will probably find very specific groups of patients where they're going to be beneficial. They're subcutaneous therapies again, they're non-factor. But these are different because they will work also in hemophilia B patients. And so they have a broader group of patients in which they will work. I also believe that gene therapy is going to probably get better, and that we're going to run into an era where we will probably be trying to do gene editing at some point. And that is what could probably guarantee patients much more predictable and stable expression of any given factor. And there have even been presentations of expressing factor VIII and factor IX in cells that are protected from the immune system by these artificial barriers that can be easily put into people and then taken out if needed. And so just the sheer number of possibilities and choices of therapies that fit a patient's risk profile and lifestyle, to me, is actually mind-boggling, having grown up in an era that is just factor and more factor. And so I think that when these trials are done, they're enrolling lots of people. I think, again, safety is the number one issue. But we are going to see, I believe, therapies that will are going to push the edge of really making bleeding in hemophilia actually an adverse event. And what I mean by that is, like, right now, in hemophilia clinical trials are so good in these products when used that way that annualized bleed rates, if you believe that outcome, are really approaching zero. And so going into the future, right, I mean, if you actually have bleeding on one of these newer products, that really should be unusual. And I'm uncertain that we could have said that 5 years ago.
This is so exciting. I got goosebumps just hearing about this and your perspective. From a physician's perspective, what do you recommend to patients that might be listening, families, caregivers that might be listening? What are your recommendations in terms of being patient for this and being informed about all of this? What can folks do?
Right. So one thing is that I would say do your best to educate yourself on this, but also I would go and talk to your providers about this, your hematologist, because everyone is pretty excited about all of these new therapies. And they're excited about how engaged patients are too. There is little data, of course, on a lot of these therapies in terms of outcomes, and so I think being engaged with your local hemophilia chapter, with your local HTC and the providers, are going to be your best source of information. But what I would say is that I think people need to talk about it. They need to kind of talk about what they really want out of therapy. What are the goals that they have for their own lives, and where hemophilia fits in there? Because I think that that is a much deeper and sometimes more difficult conversation, but I think it will lead you towards the path of choosing a therapy that is probably best for you. I think that for the most part, that has been hard to do in the past because of the limitations of what we could offer. But I think that patients should be able to come in now and really put things, on the table that are really aspirations. They're what ifs. They are things that I've always wondered about. Is it possible to? I think those are really, we should discuss them all again, because I think that we're all prepared to do that now.
What's the outlook for mild and moderate hemophilia patients? And this includes women who have mild hemophilia. What is the outlook in terms of treatment for those patients?
So for many of those patients, it's really, it's somewhat varied. So for women, for instance, right, it's finding all of the women that need treatment and to give them the treatment that they deserve. These therapies can be used for all of them. So, for instance, in that example, if you had a woman who had heavy menstrual bleeding and she also had a low factor 8, and let's say it was 10%, for example, and there are many people who are probably listening that could be in that category, and they then have trouble with heavy menstrual bleeding. Some of this new extended factor 8 would be phenomenal, because you could probably just give a single dose to help a patient through that. So I think that these new therapies apply there. I think for mild and moderate patients, my prediction is that we will understand them better going into the future. So we don't typically see a lot of mild patients every year. I wouldn't say that they're lost to follow-up, but oftentimes their symptoms are a lot milder, or their needs of HTC resources are a lot less. And because of that, we don't study them as much. We don't understand them as well. But they still have hemophilia, and they still have problems related to bleeding. But now, with these new therapies, there are going to be a lot of those patients where all of these severes have been somewhat turned into moderate to mild patients, and we're going to start to understand, just because of sheer volume, how to better care for them. These new therapies, though, can potentially take moderate and mild patients into much higher levels of bleeding protection. And so I think it's exciting to think about in select patients that you could really realistically aim for, almost no bleeding in their daily lives, and you could do so with very little interference. So that, I think, will take time, for people to recognize, for care systems to be able to deliver. But I think that these therapies are going to be available to everybody.
Moving away specifically from gene therapy, what does non-factor replacement therapy mean, and what is being developed in this class of drugs or thought?
Sure. So non-factor therapy is really a segment of products that are developed to prevent bleeding, not necessarily treat bleeding, and as opposed to what we've been doing for many years, which is to replace the factor that is missing. They look at the mechanism of how those missing factors work, and they try to get around them or rebalance them. So, for instance, Emmysysm AB is a bispecific antibody, and it really binds the two partners that factor 8 tries to get together, activated 9 and factor 10. And fitusiran is a rebalancing therapy. It tries to lower a natural anticoagulant, antithrombin, down to 20%, somewhat rebalancing the bleeding tendency of missing factor 8 or 9 to the clotting tendency of missing antithrombin as an anticoagulant. And the anti-tissue factor pathway inhibitor non-factor replacement products work in the same way, but a little higher up in the coagulation process to, again, try to rebalance them without actually giving a specific factor that the patient isn't making enough of. I think these are really, really exciting therapies, mainly because they are all able to be given in much simpler fashion, meaning that they're all subcutaneous medications, and many of them can be given very infrequently. So Emmysysm AB can be given as infrequently as once every 4 weeks, and fitusiran can be given monthly as a single subcutaneous injection. So the protection looks like it's very good, but the burden of administration is a lot less. The biggest concern that I think we have here about all of the non-factor products is that they don't fit into our traditional thinking of how coagulation works. And so we believe that they're going to have many unintended consequences in terms of how coagulation is actually working in the patient that are not predictable. And so whether that be a higher risk for getting a blood clot in a specific situation, for instance, let's say infection, we won't know until these drugs are really used in people who have those circumstances. And so I think that whereas we are all excited that these products seem to work well in their first clinical trials and licensure trials, they have looked to be very safe. We do know that we don't fully know all of the consequences of how they work. And so that is where I think there's going to be a lot of focus actually in research and really understanding that. And as a side note of that, it's going to make us understand actually how factor 8 and factor 9 work a lot better. There's going to be a lot more focus on not just replacing the factor 8 or the factor 9, for instance, but really trying to understand what is it that factor 8 and factor 9 are doing, and are there even better ways to innovate to get around what they actually do than we have now.
So how far along are some of these trials for non-factor replacement therapy, fitusiran and those types of things? Where are they, and what is the timeline?
Yeah, they're very far along. So, Emmysysm AB is now approved for all hemophilia A patients, inhibitor and non-inhibitor. Fitusiran is in its phase 3 portion, and it is now beginning to enroll pediatric patients. And so they have a very full adult cohort that has made it for a good amount of time with enough safety data to allow them to start to use it in children. The tissue factor pathway inhibitor clinical trials are going to start in phase 3 now, and there will be 2 separate phase 3 trials out there for a daily versus a weekly subcutaneous injection of those drugs. From the time that they start, even though they're all innovative therapies, to the time that they get to the patient, if everything goes well, is probably at least 2 to 3 years. But again, fitusiran is really getting past the adults, and so it could potentially get approved next in the next few years for anybody over the age of 12, and then the anti-TFPI molecules will follow that by about a year. And so they're all in phase 3 trials, which means that they're all at the point where the FDA would look at the data from this next trial and decide if it can be available to patients commercially.
So, Dr. Mike, there has been some news recently about Emmysysm AB and the deaths that have been reported in patients that have been using Emmy circulating in our community. What does the physician community think about this issue?
Right. I think that all of the physicians here and physicians I speak to nationally and internationally are concerned about all of the deaths on all of the trials. We ask the companies to be as transparent as possible as to the circumstances, the very specific situations where these patients and providers ran into trouble. And I feel like we've gotten really good information. I think that that many of the explanations for some of the Emmysysm AB deaths have made sense in terms of the use of FIBA, and that certainly now, after we haven't used it, we haven't seen subsequent events like that. Some of the deaths have been for causes that aren't related to the drug. Some of them were in compassionate use situations, which I think is a really difficult situation to actually have a person have a death during a trial, and that's because those patients are generally or almost exclusively chosen because their severity of their illness and what's available to them to be treated simply isn't working, and why that isn't working, it isn't clearly understood. And so they appear to me, at least, to be pretty high-risk patients where people are having to make the difficult choice of risk and benefit. And the risk seems so much smaller because the potential benefits of any even small incremental benefit is great. And so, again, this goes back to the point where I think that we are comfortable with the therapies that are out there because we feel like we're getting information in a good amount of time and that there are plausible explanations. But that is all really predicated for us on the quality of the communication and the relationship we have with our patients. And so I am more concerned in choosing the potential wrong drug for the wrong patient because we just don't know what we don't know, right? I think that if we can offer patients a clinical atmosphere where they feel open and safe to talk about their concerns, what they actually do in their lives, and ask difficult questions, and where clinicians feel the responsibility and the empowerment to have that difficult conversation back and say, I don't think as much as it could benefit you that the risk is worth it. But really having those really in-depth conversations in a really, really safe environment, I think, is what's going to drive the safety of all of these products. And when you step back just, even a half a step, that's just better clinical care, right? It's knowing your patients better. It's giving them an environment to speak in. It's allowing them to really have their opinions known and fully acknowledged and, as part of the decision-making process. I think if you go through all of that, we'll make a lot better decisions. And then in those circumstances, I have to acknowledge that there are still unknowns and that you can have bad outcomes, but I would think that you have talked through that, and that in the end, that the decision is really informed, and that it's really what everybody around the table believes is the best decision for that patient.
Dr. Mike, you just answered all of my final questions to wrap up classically. Thank you. No, thank you so much. This was wonderful. I value your time, and this will be so informative to patients. Again, what are some resources for patients that are continuing to want to stay informed and to stay in the know with the latest clinical trial information? Where can they go for that?
Right. So I think that their HTCs are a great place to call and ask. I think now, information is so readily available on the internet, but I would go to your national and international foundations. The WFH specifically and the NHF have really put forward a lot of effort to try to get information, and I know specifically for gene therapy, but also for the non-factor therapies out there. MASAC is a great place to turn, but also all of the other organizations that have grown around the hemophilia community as well. Everyone has their own personal preferences and biases, but I know people across all of these organizations, and they're all really trying to do the best thing. I really believe so, and so I think that again, go out and ask multiple sources. I think single source decision making probably isn't the best thing right now, and so go to multiple sources, but I would say go to them all, because I think these are big decisions and they're different, and that patients should gather, I think, the maximal amount of information they can.
What an exciting time. Thank you so much, Dr. Mike, for your time and for sharing all of your knowledge and experience with our listeners.
Absolutely. Thanks for giving me the opportunity.
And that is all for episode 33 of the Ask the Expert podcast series. I encourage you to start conversations with your trusted circle about future treatments in the hemophilia space. Please remember, we are all in this together. We'll be back next month with another expert interview. BloodstreamMedia.com is your one-stop shop for all of Bloodstream Media's podcasts for the bleeding disorder community.
Once on BloodstreamMedia.com, don't forget to follow the links to subscribe to the Bloodstream Podcast, Ask the Expert Podcast, the Powering Through Podcast, and the Bloodline Podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Have an idea for a future episode of Ask the Expert? Have a question that you would like to hear an expert answer?
Email us at mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. You'll also find Bloodstream Media on facebook.com/bloodstreammedia and on Twitter @bloodstreaminfo.
This episode of Ask the Expert was written by Amy Board.
Produced by Patrick James Lynch,
Rob Bradford,
Joshua Sterling Bragg,
Avra Friedman,
and Colby Crow.
Artwork by Katie Wright-Mead.
and Ryan Geelan.
And the Ask the Expert podcast is edited by Allison Stoney.
I'm your host, Amy Board, and until next time, embrace that mystery and fear of life. You are not alone.